Welcome back, honeys, and welcome to December. Our episode for you today is a little bit different, almost sort of a variety show, in that we'll be talking about multiple artists who have one very specific thing in common. Now, some people in life know what they want to do and they get right down to it. Others, though, are lucky enough to have windy career paths that involve stumbling into just the right thing at just the right time. And still others know what they want to do, but must do other things because of living expenses. All of the artists we're going to talk about today fall into that third category. They range in fame from household names to up-and-comers, so let's talk about some major art historical cases of these artists who worked their way to their dream careers. I'm hoping we can all find this to be a hopeful, happy topic for this holiday month. As always, your source document for our information today is linked in the episode description. And here we go. Our list goes in no particular order, and the first one on it just so happens to be Joseph Cornell. Cornell lived from 1903 to 1972 and was an assemblage sculptor known for his shadow boxes made up of found objects. But before he was a well-recognized artist, he held a number of jobs. He was a salesman at a textile company in Manhattan from 1921 until sometime during the Depression. Our sources weren't exactly clear which year. But this textile salesman job required him to walk to menswear retailers citywide with a suitcase full of fabric samples. This really allowed Cornell to explore, as part of his job, the bustling urban landscape, plus Manhattan's cultural scene. For example, he would go to the Met Opera shows. He would go to avant-garde galleries, the Whitney studios. Such experiences would inspire a lot of his later art. After losing that job in the Depression, he worked briefly as a door-to-door appliance salesman, then went back to textiles as a designer for the Traphagen Commercial Textile Studio between 1934 and 1940. After that, he also worked as a freelance designer for various magazines before committing full-time to his art practice. Next up, we have an artist from our Colorworks episode, ATPPO Part 2, Agnes Martin. She was an American abstract painter who lived 1912 to 2004 and was particularly known for her minimalist style of abstract expressionism. As for her jobs before, she was a busy lady. According to a 1980 list she sent to her friend and gallery owner, Arnold Glimcher, the following is a list of the jobs she had at some point during her life. Managing cherry pickers, baking, working at a hamburger stand, but Martin's primary profession was teaching. She received her teaching certificate in 1937 and spent 3 years going about teaching in rural high schools across Washington state. She went on to get her bachelor's degree from Teachers College at Columbia and then began moving around nationally with regularity. Yet Martin continued to teach at schools in Washington, Delaware, and New Mexico. Before returning to the Columbia Teachers School for her master's, she also spent a little time studying and teaching at the University of New Mexico. All in all, it seems Martin was an intellectual. She was interested in teaching as much as she was in her artistic practice. Next up, we have a more contemporary name, Jeff Koons. Born in 1955, he is an American artist who's mostly known for large-scale installations as well as sculptures that seem to push the boundaries between pop culture and fine arts. Koons' first full-time job after graduating from art school was as a desk clerk for membership services at MoMA. Then, in a complete left turn, he moved on to brokerage in 1980, getting his license to sell mutual funds and stocks. But there was a bit of strategy here. He used his day job as a broker to finance his art projects in the early 80s until he got his big art world break in 1985. That was with his so-called groundbreaking show called Equilibrium. It included basketballs floating in aquariums and life-saving devices cast in bronze. The subsequent fame allowed Koons to leave the finance industry and focus and work full-time on his art. Though our sources note, quote, ironically, Koons had started his career as a commodities broker with the sole intention of allowing him to make artwork that was completely independent from the art market, end quote. Also on our list today, Richard Serra, who you might remember from the first edition of ATPPO, Getting in Your Space. Serra lived from 1938 until early this year of 2024. He was an American minimalist sculptor known for working with large-scale sheet metal assemblies. And what was Serra's job before his full-time art career? Furniture removal. During the 60s, Serra started this removal business in New York to support his art and generally struggling self. Called, rather simply, low-rate movers, it was based in Lower Manhattan. And importantly, Serra employed many of his fellow struggling artist friends, including avant-garde composers Philip Glass and Steve Reich, painter Chuck Close, actor Spalding Gray, and experimental filmmaker Michael Snow. Though certainly not glamorous, this was a really useful and good job for these artists in the sense that it let them all have several days a week to work exclusively on their practices. They could also use the furniture removal equipment for their own art-moving purposes. Next, an artist who's near and dear to my heart, Miss Barbara Kruger, who was born in 1945 and is an American conceptual artist mostly known for her collage style. It often consists of black and white photographs overlaid with declarative captions stated in white on red text that has been ripped off by the brand Supreme. Kruger had a bit of a windy path. In 1965, she dropped out of Syracuse University, then spent a semester at Parsons School of Design in New York. In 1966, she lands a job as a graphic designer at Condé Nast and also sometimes works on Mademoiselle magazine, which was in women's fashion. In 1967, Kruger is promoted to the magazine's head designer position. In 1969, however, Kruger begins to walk her own path. She starts making her first artworks using these experiences in publications and also with advertising to inspire her work. She especially incorporates the use of punchy graphics and catchy slogans to convey her thoughts on these adverts' messaging surrounding power, identity, and sexuality. She moved part-time to the West Coast to teach at UC Berkeley also in 1967, and it's unclear exactly when she left the Condé Nast position for California permanently, but it seems to have been 72. Kruger has also dabbled in teaching, gone on to give a few classes here and there, and became a professor emerita at UCLA. Kruger is also a more prolific writer than I ever realized. She's written columns for Artforum reviewing films, TV, and music. Next up, more of a household name, Mark Rothko, a color-field painter seen as one of the great abstract artists of history. He lived 1903 to 1970. For much of his early life, Rothko actually wanted to be a labor union organizer, but life took him in several other directions instead. He dropped out of Yale after 2 years, though he received a full ride. He then became interested in the art scene when he moved to New York in 1923. During the mid to late 20s, he did odd jobs at places like New York's Garment Center, along with working as a bookkeeper for his tax attorney relative. He took various other classes as well at Parsons School of Design. In 1928, he exhibits work for the first time with a group of other young artists and starts seeing some success as an artist. Yet Rothko still needed to supplement his income, so in 1929 he begins giving classes in painting and clay sculpture at the Center Academy of the Brooklyn Jewish Center. He held this teaching position until 1952, but then continued to teach at the Brooklyn College until 1954, when he was finally really able to achieve independence as an artist. Next up, a name featured in a somewhat recent business. We have Ai Weiwei. Born in 1957, he's a Chinese contemporary artist, documentarian, and activist. Having first moved to the U.S. in 1981, in 83, he moves to New York and then studies briefly at the Parsons School of Design, which is really becoming a repeat name in this episode, before attending the Art Students League of New York for about 3 years and then dropping out of that. Ai then makes his living out of drawing street portraits, trading antiques, working on jobs like house painting and carpentry. While living in the East Village, though, he becomes fascinated by blackjack card games. He then becomes a frequent Atlantic City casino visitor and becomes widely known in American blackjack circles in the 1880s and early 1990s because he was just really, really good at it. He picked up the game quite naturally. In fact, in gambling circles, the artist is still regarded as a top-tier professional blackjack player. Our sources note that when he was detained by the Chinese government in 2011, the American blackjack community was so outraged that suggestions floated around to hold blackjack tournaments to raise money to lobby for his release. Ike continues to gamble recreationally, though he is a full-time artist for sure at this point. Our next two artists, both modernists, worked in various museums as staff members. First, let's talk about Dan Flavin, who did just about everything one could in the museum support staff realm. He lived between 1933 and 1996 and was an American minimalist artist famous for creating sculptural objects and installations from commercial light fixtures, often with multiple colors. Out of maybe any artist we will cover today, he had the most varied support staff careers as well. He transitioned from being a mailroom worker at the Guggenheim Museum to becoming a guard at the MoMA between 1959 and 1960. Then became a guard at the American Museum of Natural History in the summer of '61. With the 1960s, it came broader recognition from the art world of Flavin's pieces, especially with Flavin having admitted to studying and admiring ready-mades by Duchamp. He was seen as the sort of next stage in that ready-made evolution. Another staff member turned artist himself was Sol LeWitt, who worked at the MoMA. LeWitt was an American artist linked to various movements, including conceptual art and minimalism, living 1928 to 2007. In 1960, he joined the book counterstaff of MoMA through the efforts of his cousin, who already worked at the museum. LeWitt switched about a year later to take over the evening entry desk coverage position at the 53rd Street doors. Although LeWitt had his kind of first big break in the late 1960s with his wall drawings, he did not become accepted by critics and didn't really achieve until his 1978 retrospective at the MoMA. I'm sure that was a very full circle moment for him. Next up is another household name, Mr. Keith Haring, who lived 1958 to 1990. The pop artwork of this American artist addressed political and societal themes and grew out of New York City's 1980s street culture. Before Haring began progressing onto large-scale murals and achieving the art world's notice, he was still working on public street spaces, but he also worked as a busboy at Danceteria. Danceteria was a well-known, at the time, 4-floor nightclub in New York City operating between 1979 and 1986. And a sort of bonus artist for you here, this is the same club Madonna worked at as a coat check girl in the early 80s. Another woman on our list here, Dorothea Lange. Living between 1895 and 1965, she was an American documentary photographer and photojournalist. She's best known for her Depression-era work for the Farm Security Administration. If there's any photo of hers you'd recognize, it's the one of the mother holding a child looking off into the distance, holding one hand to her chin. So what was Lange's story, her jobs before? She always planned to become a photographer. When she graduated high school in the early 1900s, she went on to study photography at Columbia University in New York. Lange attempted a bout of world travel with a friend in 1918, trying to leave from New York, but she was forced to end the trip after the two were robbed in San Francisco. Somewhat forced to settle there, Lange decides to begin work at a photographic supply shop as a photo finisher. Though it was not her ideal job, as it wasn't her behind the lens, this was surprisingly beneficial to her art and career. She got to know local photographers and met an investor through the shop who helped her set up her own photography studio. This studio, a portrait-taking business, supported Lange and her family for the next 15 years. Only with the onset of the Depression era did she step out of the studio and start taking pictures on the street and around the country of the world and people around her. And the rest, as we know from the pictures, is history. Also on this list, we have Jackson Pollock. Born in 1912 and passing relatively young in 1956, he was a major figure, as I'm sure we all know, in the abstract expressionist movement and gestural techniques of the 20th century. Yet before all that, he was another museum worker. He joined Rebé's Museum of Non-Objective Art staff in early 1943 for a very short time. He still managed to work on his art a ton outside of the job and submitted one of his works for consideration to the Spring Salon for Young Artists at Peggy Guggenheim's influential gallery, Art of This Century. The custodian and maintenance man did so well there that Guggenheim offered Pollock a multi-year gallery contract and a monthly stipend, which allowed him to quit his job at the Rebé's Museum. From then on, he was able to dedicate his time exclusively to his painting. And we have just 3 artists left for the day, honeys, 3 contemporary ones at that. We'll begin with Genesis Ballinger, who was born in 1978 and is best known for her surrealistic ceramics, which often critique consumerist culture. Before making the switch to the kiln, she worked in New York Magazine publication spheres, often as a prop stylist assistant. But the benefit here was that it provided her firsthand experience of the power of advertising, as well as spatial arrangements. In various interviews, she not only suggests that the job was eye-opening in terms of how much of advertising is staged and how deeply, she also says, quote, "What the job showed me was that beauty is actually immensely powerful. In fact, it's one of the most powerful tools used to sell us almost everything in our world. It was really freeing for me to realize that I could make complex but beautiful things, and that wasn't frivolous. In fact, it might be a really fantastic tool for communication," end quote. Her pieces are now in the collections of several contemporary art museums. We also have Mark Bradford, born in 1961. Bradford is recognized for his internationally shown collaged painting works, video and installation works as well. What did he do before adopting art full-time? He worked as a hairstylist at his mother's beauty shop in LA. Bradford has frequently referred to the salon as his, quote, first studio, end quote. It was the first place he felt attracted by hair papers' translucency and colors and began experimenting with their use in his paintings. This everyday and commercial material became an inspiration for his signature style, which he calls social abstraction. Says Bradford on his technique, quote, "I learned my own way of constructing paintings through the end papers. How to create space, how to use color, and how to provide a new kind of content," end quote. And our last artist for the day, honeys, J. Lynn Gomez. Gomez's artwork addresses social justice issues, largely focusing on topics of immigration, race, and labor. Before achieving recognition by the larger contemporary arts world, the 38-year-old was a live-in nanny to a Beverly Hills family. Gomez recalls that the family also employed many other workers to aid their lavish lifestyle. But eventually, Gomez came to notice that while celebrities would be photographed while out and about, her fellow nannies and other domestic employees would be cropped from the same shots which appeared in the papers. Gomez was therefore inspired to begin trying to show how her colleagues seemed to be unacknowledged, even disposable, through her artwork. This is why she paints figures of such unseen workers onto pages torn from luxury magazines, but she does not give them any distinct facial features. At first, she would make this work from luxury magazines she found around her employer's house and wanted to keep the work hidden from said employers. But about 2 years after she began it, Gomez started a blog to make her work public and pursued art full-time. Based on our discussion of her today, we know she did that pretty successfully. And with that, honeys, we have reached the end of our career list artist rundown bonanza. If there's one takeaway I hope you get from this episode, one main point of it, it's that artists are amazing at finding solutions, at finding work, and therefore ways to support their art. And a bit more universally and positively, we all shouldn't be so afraid to take a detour. Clearly, it can work out in the end. And with that being said, honeys, this is where I leave you until our next business. Don't forget to participate in our prize giveaway on Instagram. Remember, you only need to like and comment on one post to enter. Make sure to get on top of that before the deadline runs out. Hydrate or dihydrate, take care of yourselves, and talk soon. This podcast is produced, created, hosted, formerly edited, and fact-checked by master's degree holder Celia Bugnout. Chris Meinhold is responsible for our editing, mixing, and our intro and outro music. Special thanks to him for that. And as always, remember to like, subscribe, share, comment, so on all your favorite listening as well as social media channels.